Welcome back to our second installment of chapters from my autobiography by Mark Twain. I'm Jerry Flanagan, and today we step directly into Samuel Clemens's world as he narrates his transition from a wandering journalist to a global literary icon. This segment focuses on his public identity, the chaotic life of his brother Orion, the social comedies that defined his public career, and the passing of his wife Livy and daughter Susie. To maintain the apparently systemless system, I will let the man himself speak, drawing from the 250,000 words he left for us to find.
Chapter 10. The Birth of an Author and the Prize Ass. My formal experiences as an author began in 1867 when I arrived in New York from San Francisco. At that time, my reputation was a slender, attenuated thing resting almost entirely on a single story, The Jumping Frog. I was acutely aware that while the frog was celebrated in the newspapers of America and England, I remained in total obscurity. When I approached the publishing firm Carleton with a volume of sketches, the reception was so cold that the old gold entrenchments in the roof of my mouth contracted and my teeth fell out. I reminded him that I was there by appointment to offer him my book for publication. He began to swell and went on swelling and swelling and swelling until he had reached the dimensions of a god of about the second or third degree. Then the fountains of his great deep were like a biblical deluge, and for 2 or 3 minutes I couldn't see him for the rain. It was words, only words, but they fell so densely that they darkened the atmosphere. Finally, he made an imposing sweep with his right hand, which comprehended the whole room, and said,
"Books. Look at those shelves. Every one of them is loaded with books that are waiting for publication. Do I want any more? Excuse me, I don't. Good morning."
21 years elapsed before I saw Carleton again. I was then sojourning with my family in Luzerne. He called on me, shook hands cordially, and said at once, without any preliminaries,
"I am substantially an obscure person, but I have at least one distinction to my credit of such colossal dimensions that it entitles me to immortality, to wit. I refused a book of yours, and for this I stand without competitor as the prize ass of the 19th century."
It was a most handsome apology, and I told him so, and said it was a long-delayed revenge, but was sweeter to me than any other that could be devised. That during the lapsed 21 years I had, in fancy, taken his life several times every year, and always in new and increasingly cruel and inhuman ways, but that now I was pacified, appeased, happy, even jubilant, and that henceforth I should hold him my true and valued friend, and never kill him again. My battle with Elisha Bliss over The Innocents Abroad was equally trying. Bliss's directors were staid old fossils who were terrified that a book with humorous characters would ruin the house's reputation. One director, a pathetic old relic named Drake, even took me for a buggy ride to beg me to release them from the contract. I refused, eventually threatening a lawsuit if the book wasn't on sale within 24 hours. When it was finally launched, it took the house out of debt and left $70,000 in profit, which was likely the first time Bliss had told the truth in 65 years. Chapter 11. The Riddle of Orion. A life of red-hot eagernesses. If you wish to see human nature in its most capricious form, you must look at my brother Orion Clemens. Born 10 years before me, Orion was a man who woke every morning with a fresh eagerness that consumed him all day, only to perish in the night. He exploited 365 new eagernesses every year. His days were mottled with alternating brilliant sunshine and deep gloom. He joined and taught in a new Sunday school every time he changed his religion, and he traded religions as often as some men trade horses. Orion was the only person I knew in whom pessimism and optimism were lodged in exactly equal proportions. He was as unstable as water, yet his principles were unshakable. He remained a staunch abolitionist while living in a slaveholding community. However, in matters of politics or religion, he never acquired a conviction that could survive a disapproving remark from a cat. His business life was a procession of failures. He bought a newspaper in Hannibal with borrowed money and immediately ensured its ruin by reducing the subscription price until there was no hope of profit. Later, he tried a chicken farm in Keokuk, where he discovered it cost $1.60 to raise a pair of chickens he could only sell for $1.25. He even sent me monthly statements detailing his losses, which included the 10 cents he gave to missionaries trying to damn the Chinese. One of his most strange episodes occurred during a political campaign. In the morning, he was a Republican and prepared a speech. By the afternoon, he had become a Democrat and wrote slogans for their torchlight protest signs, and they occupied so much of his time that it was night before he had a chance to change his politics again. So he actually made a rousing Republican campaign speech in the open air while his Democratic protest signs passed by in front of him. To the joy of every witness present, he died as he lived, in the middle of a project, with a pencil in his hand and a word unfinished on the paper. Chapter 12. The Etiquette of the Pistol. In 1864, dueling became a fashion in Nevada. One didn't feel respectable until they had killed or crippled someone in this new sport. My friend Joe Goodman accepted a challenge from Tom Fitch, the silver-tongued orator, and was instructed by a filibustering major to aim below the knee, to leave the rest of him to his mother. Joe tumbled Fitch with a bullet through the leg, which earned Fitch a permanent limp and Goodman the admiration of the staff. A year later, I got my own chance when I woke up Mr. Laird of the Virginia Union, a rival newspaper with some vitriolic editorial courtesies. My co-worker Steve sent challenges to him, with each hotter than the last, and we waited. Nothing came of them. I began to feel quite comfortable. I began to take an interest in the challenges myself. I had not felt any before, but it seemed to me that I was accumulating a great and valuable reputation at no expense, and my delight in this grew and grew as challenge after challenge was declined. Oh well, I overdid it because midnight came, and I was beginning to think that there was nothing in the world so much to be desired as a chance to fight a duel. But Laird accepted. I might have known that that would happen. Laird was a man you couldn't depend on. I had plenty of things to think about now, and less than 4 hours to do it in, because 5 o'clock was the appointed hour for the tragedy, and I should have to use up 1 hour, beginning at 4 a.m., in practicing with the revolver and finding out which end of it to level at the adversary. We went down into a little gorge, about a mile from town, and borrowed a barn door for a mark. Borrowed it of a man who was over in California on a visit, and we set the barn door up and stood a fence rail up against the middle of it to represent Mr. Laird. But the rail was no proper representative of him, for he was longer than a rail and thinner. I began on the rail. I couldn't hit the rail. Then I tried the barn door, but I couldn't hit the barn door. There was nobody in danger except stragglers around on the flanks of that mark. I was thoroughly discouraged, and I didn't cheer up any when we presently heard pistol shots over in the next little ravine. I knew what that was. That was Laird's gang out practicing him. They would hear my shots, and of course they would come up over the ridge to see what kind of a record I was making, see what their chances were against me. Well, I hadn't any record, and I knew that if Laird came over that ridge and saw my barn door without a scratch on it, he would be as anxious to fight as I was, or as I had been at midnight before that disastrous acceptance came. Suddenly, while practicing, a small bird lit on a sage bush 30 yards away, and my second, Steve Gillis, shot its head off. When Laird's people arrived and saw the headless bird, Steve calmly lied and told them I had done it and that I could do it 4 times out of 5. Laird sent back a note declining to fight on any terms, and my life was saved by an interposition of Providence. We were soon informed by Judge North that we had better leave the territory by the first stagecoach or spend 2 years in the penitentiary. I have never had anything to do with duels since. If a man challenged me now, I would lead him to a quiet spot and kill him. Chapter 13. Society, Politics, and Submerged Renown. My life in the public eye brought me into contact with many illustrious figures, though I often found the uncelebrated just as interesting. I remember visiting Grover Cleveland when he was governor. I was born lazy, and I comforted myself by sitting on the corner of his table. Suddenly, 16 clerks emerged from 16 different doors and lined up in expectation. The governor calmly dismissed them, explaining that I was sitting on the bells, a cluster of 16 buttons I had accidentally hatched out that alerted the clerks. Then there was Harriet Beecher Stowe, our neighbor in Hartford, whose mind had begun to decay. She would wander our grounds and slip up behind people to fetch a war whoop that would jump them out of their clothes. Her husband, Professor Stowe, was so picturesque with his long white beard that my daughter Susie, upon seeing him, cried out, "Santa Claus has got loose." During a conversation with Robert Louis Stevenson on a bench in Washington Square, we coined the phrase submerged renown. We were discussing an author named Davis, whose books moved by the freight train load among the dense region of eternal drudgery, where his popularity was gold and adamant and indestructible, because it remained untouched by the newspaper sneers and reviews of the mainstream literary critics in the surface world. Chapter 14. The Whittier Birthday Cataclysm. Perhaps my greatest public humiliation occurred at the Whittier birthday dinner in Boston in 1877. I delivered a speech imagining a miner meeting Emerson, Longfellow, and Holmes as drunken impostors. I had memorized it perfectly and expected it to be the gem of the evening, but after the first 200 words, the interest in the faces turned to a sort of black frost. I went on in front of people who seemed turned to stone with horror. When I sat down, I was as dead and miserable as a man can be in this world. Howells tried to gasp a comforting word, but his words froze before they could get out. He eventually hitched himself to me to lead us from the room like corpses. Years later, I reread the speech and found it saturated with humor and perfectly harmless. The fault was not in the speech, but in my own doubt and fear that night. Chapter 15. Reflections on the Embroidery of Truth. I have been used to having my statements discounted since I was 7 years old. Any person who is familiar with me knows how to strike my average, and therefore knows how to get at the jewel of any fact of mine and dig it out of its blue clay matrix. My mother knew that art. When I was 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 years old, along there, a neighbor said to her, "Do you ever believe anything that boy says?" My mother replied that I was a wellspring of truth, though she noted you couldn't bring up the whole well with one bucket. She would discount me 30% for embroidery and cherish the rest as priceless truth without a flaw in it anywhere. Yet all through my life, my facts have had a substratum of truth, and therefore they were not without preciousness. I once tested the limits of this truth at a meeting of the Monday Evening Club. We were out of good cigars, so I had my butler, George, bring out a box of Wheeling Long Nines that kill at 30 yards. A frost fell upon the brilliant company the moment they lit them. Within minutes, the room was empty, as every guest invented a pretext to flee the smirch of my cheap tobacco. The next morning, George told me you couldn't walk from the front door to the upper gate without treading on a cigar every step of the way. Chapter 16. The Ivory Miniature and the Buffalo Comedy. I have arrived at 70 years, and to understand the man who stands before the public, you must first know the woman who made that man possible. Our life together began with a conspiracy. After our wedding in Elmira, Livy and I were driven all over Buffalo in sleighs, supposedly searching for a humble boarding house. I was scolding my friend for his stupidity in not finding the place, until we arrived at a fairy-like mansion on Delaware Avenue. Her father, Jervis Langdon, handed me a box containing the deed to the house. It was a comedy that ended with a hot supper and the realization that I, who didn't know if beefsteak was sold by the barrel or the yard, was now the head of a household. I saw Livy for the first time in her brother Charlie's stateroom in 1867 in the form of an ivory miniature, and she remained both girl and woman to her last breath. I was born reserved as to endearments, but her limitless affection broke upon me like summer waves upon Gibraltar. She was always frail in body, living instead upon an indestructible spirit of hopefulness and courage. Throughout our years together, and especially during the poverty and debt that once dogged us, she was the only one able to reason me out of my despair. When her health finally broke in Florence, I lost my expurgator, the one who would sit with a pencil and strike out the most satisfactory, and thus too strong, passages of my manuscripts. My final years became a period of unrestricted strong language and heedless behavior, for I no longer had her watchful eye to protect me from my own minor breaches of propriety. She shared in all my humiliations, often taking the burden of my mistakes upon her own sensitive shoulders. Chapter 16. Susie, the Little Philosopher. My daughter Susie was my wonder and worship. At 14, she began her secret biography of me, noting that I was a striking character with a Roman nose and an oh-so-absent-minded nature. She was the first to see through my mask, declaring that I was as much of a philosopher as anything, and more interested in earnest subjects than humor. Susie was a deep thinker even at age 7, once asking, "Mama, what is it all for?" after brooding over the profitless road of human existence. She eventually stopped praying in the same way, because she learned the Indians had many gods, and she feared her family might be wrong. Her final prayer was a masterpiece of childlike wisdom. "I only pray that there may be a God and a heaven, or something better." She also recorded our family's brief flirtation with mind cure. I believed I could starve a cold through trust, and Livy hoped the theory could cure our nearsightedness. I had discovered Susie's nearsightedness by accident when she couldn't see our cat, Stray Kit, sleeping in a stream of sunlight only 20 feet away. Chapter 17. The Menagerie and the Fly Trust. Animals were as much a part of our family as people. I have always preferred a bad billiard table and the company of cats. We had Lazy, the gray kitten who slept on my shoulder, and others with names like Buffalo Bill, Cleveland, and Pestilence and Famine. Then there was Sour Mash, a tortoise-shell harlot who was a constant source of anxiety, care, and pleasure. My cats were more than pets. They were humble observers of pathos. I found that when I read German philosophy aloud, the cats would weep, proving that all German is pathetic regardless of the subject. They were like human beings. When one cat, Ashes, began to show off, the others followed suit just to be in the fashion. The children were equally inventive. When Livy offered our butler, George, a bounty for killing flies, the children established a fly trust. They hired all the neighborhood children on a cheap commission to collect dead flies, nearly bankrupting the family with their platefuls of evidence. Chapter 18. Showy Episodes from Vassar to the Kaiser. In 1885, I took Susie to read at Vassar College. We arrived in a soaking rain and were received with indignities and discourtesies by a sour old saint of a president. I eventually told him to retire from the platform so I could talk to the garden of young and lovely blossoms without his help. On that same trip, we visited General Ulysses Grant as he was finishing his memoirs. He was in high spirits, having finally dictated the truth about Appomattox. He told us that neither he nor Sherman originated the march to the sea. The enemy did it by leaving the path open. It was a crisp, epigrammatic sentence that I shall always remember. Years later, I dined with Wilhelm II, who was the German emperor and king of Prussia. He did most of the talking, and since he held the age, I remained silent. When he later asked why I didn't talk, I remembered the man who hadn't spoken to his wife in 15 years because he didn't want to interrupt her. The emperor's favorite book was Old Times on the Mississippi, a verdict shared by my tow-headed concierge in Berlin. It is a rare satisfaction when the top of an empire and the bottom of it deliver the same judgment. Chapter 19. The Shadow of Loss. Langdon and Susie. The sunset side of 70 years is not without its long shadows. I carry a lifelong sense of shame for the death of our first child, Langdon. I took him for a drive in a cold morning air, fell into a reverie, and allowed his furs to fall away. He died of diphtheria shortly after, and I have never truly forgiven myself for that treacherous morning's work. But the incredible calamity was the death of Susie in 1896. While Livy and Clara were at sea, flying home to nurse her, I received the cablegram. Susie was peacefully released today. She died of meningitis at age 24, the right time to die before the inevitable tragedy of responsible life begins. In her final delirium, she found a gown her mother had worn, kissed it, and cried. Her last word was, "Mama." The mind is stunned by such a shock. It takes years to discover all the essentials that are irrevocably lost. Susie's death was a thunderstroke that left our lives a smoking wreckage. Chapter 20. Final Reflections. The Soap Bubble. In her biography, Susie wrote,
"The other evening, Clara and I brought down our new soap bubble water and we all blew soap bubbles. Papa blew his soap bubbles and filled them with tobacco smoke, and as the light shone on them, they took very beautiful opaline colors. Papa would hold them and then let us catch them in our hand, and they felt delightful to the touch. The mixture of the smoke and water had a singularly pleasant effect."
It is human life. We are blown upon the world. We float buoyantly upon the summer air a little while, complacently showing off our grace of form and our dainty iridescent colors. Then we vanish with a little puff, leaving nothing behind but a memory, and sometimes not even that. I suppose that at those solemn times when we wake in the deeps of the night and reflect, there is not one of us who is not willing to confess that he is really only a soap bubble and as little worth the making. Now I declare that my principles have remained to this day what they were back in Hannibal. I was always honest. I know I can never be otherwise. It is as I said in the beginning, I was never able to persuade myself to use money which I had acquired in questionable ways. Now then, that is the tale. Some of it is true.
This concludes our summary of the autobiography of Mark Twain. I'm Jerry Flanagan, and I hope this purpose jumble has brought you face to face with the man who found the straight truth in the heart of a child. Thank you for listening.